This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. Today's episode is about fashion and feminism in the late 19th century. The late 19th century ushered in an evolution in women's fashion from the Victorian true woman, whose femininity was displayed in wide skirts and petticoats, to the new woman of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who was modern and youthful in a shirtwaist and bell-shaped skirt. American illustrator Charles Dana Gibson published a series of drawings of the new woman, which became known as the Gibson Girl, starting in a publication in The Century in 1890. The Gibson Girl was confident, but not radical. She was tall, white, and middle class, often golfing or doing other outdoor pursuits. She personified the new freedoms women were beginning to enjoy, but she was still corseted and wearing a long skirt. One of the signature items of the Gibson Girl ensemble was the shirtwaist. The shirtwaist, the women's version of the men's dress shirt, had been introduced as early as the 1860s, but it was in the 1890s that its popularity really took off. Because the shirtwaist could be both mass-produced and also sewn by household sewers from paper patterns, and because the shirtwaist could be made from a range of materials, it was available not just to middle and upper-class women, but to working and immigrant women, and also to Black women who could order shirtwaists from mail-order catalogs if they weren't welcomed into department stores. The shirtwaist and skirt ensemble worked to democratize fashion in a way that was new to the era. Back in the middle of the 19th century, feminists who were advocating for the women's vote, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, and Amelia Bloomer, had adopted a style of dress known as the Turkish dress, and eventually as bloomers, which were divided garments for the lower body, essentially wide pants. The fashion was so scandalous that it detracted from their effectiveness as reformers, and they returned to corsets and long skirts. Feminists at the turn of the century had learned this lesson well, and instead they adopted the fashion of the time and claimed public roles without being labeled as radical feminists. The changes and adaptations of the late 19th century were slower and less drastic than the Bloomer experiment, but they were important in allowing women greater access to public spaces. In particular, the growing popularity of the bicycle in the middle classes in the 1890s gave women freedom they hadn't had before. The safety bicycle, introduced in 1886, had a dropped frame design that accommodated women's skirts while riding. In 1896, Susan B. Anthony said that the bicycle has, quote, done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance. Because cycling was done in public, the costumes worn for bicycling were visible to all and had an effect on fashion. In particular, corsets were loosened for bicycling, and some women wore bloomers. Bloomers again failed to catch on as popular fashion. So instead, some women who rode bicycles wore skirts that were divided but looked like regular skirts from the outside. Most popularly, women cyclists wore shorter skirts that generally stopped right at the top of the boot. Some women enjoyed the freedom and comfort of the shorter skirt so much that they wanted to wear shorter skirts all of the time. They pointed especially to the difficulty of walking down a muddy or snow-covered street with long skirts, and the health concerns that came with dragging wet, dirty skirts with them everywhere they went. In 1896, a number of society and career women in New York formed a club called the Rainy Day Club to, quote, secure health and comfort by sanitary methods of dress, and at the same time to encourage the use of costumes that are genuinely artistic, graceful, and modest, unquote. Many of the women were younger, under 30, and represented the new woman in the workforce. The Rainy Daisies, as they became known, drew a lot of media attention, and they expanded to branches in several other towns in New York, along with Somerville, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Ann Arbor, and St. Louis. In addition to shorter skirts, club members also pushed for other practical improvements to women's fashion, including lighter fabrics, higher boots, and even pockets, defined as women's greatest lack and a major hindrance to women's progress. According to Dr. Einav Rabinovich-Fox, for the new woman of the 1900s, the shirtwaist and the short skirt became the epitome of and the terrain from which she could negotiate political, racial, gender, economic, and social equality. Yet it was not the shorter hemline of the skirt or the looseness of the shirtwaist that made the Gibson Girl ensemble liberating. But it was the meanings that women gave the outfit, using it to reflect their own interpretation of fashion. Indeed, the new woman and her fashions reflected her generation, women who were beginning to do away with ideas of gender hierarchy and to claim new statuses and freedoms, but who were not completely ready to denounce the traditions with which they grew up. To help us understand more, I'm joined now by Dr. Rabinovich-Fox, author of the upcoming book, Dressed for Freedom, The Fashionable Politics of American Feminism, which is also the source for much of this introduction. So, hi, Einav. Thanks so much for joining me today. And I wanted to start just by asking you how you got interested in fashion history.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. It's great to be here. And I wasn't so interested in fashion history, but more in kind of like interested in history of feminism and feminist movement. And what I was always kind of like bothered by, I have to say, was like why feminists have such bad PR, right? Why they have this reputation that they're ugly and that they're not fashionable and this all. I believe in women's equality, but I'm not a feminist because I like to wear high heels, so makeup. And I was like, but why are these two kind of like, where does that come from? Why kind of like feminist has such a bad reputation? And when I started to kind of like look at suffragists and feminists in the early 20th century, I was really surprised to kind of like to see in all the cover in the magazines, and everybody told like how beautiful they were and how good they looked, and they themselves kind of like were very obsessed with kind of like fashion and appearance. And I was like, well, so maybe there's something here that we need to kind of like, it's more of a complicated story to tell.
Yeah.
So I kind of like went and looked back and try to unravel this myth that feminism and fashion are kind of like opposing forces. And I was trying to kind of like, wait a minute. No, it's actually not as black white as we like to think. And I really, I was really surprised and happy that I guess like, women just like to look good and to talk about fashion, and feminists were not so different in that regard, not 100 years ago and not now.
Yeah, so this early history that you start with in the sort of starting in the 1890s, and full disclosure, I watch a lot of Murdoch mysteries, so this sort of fashion was very familiar to me. I was like, oh yes, that's exactly what the women are wearing. So this sort of Gibson Girl look. When you were writing, especially that section, but the whole book that you're writing, what are the kinds of sources that you're looking at? And it seems like at least some of this gets to be sort of looking at magazines and pictures, which seems kind of fun. But what are the ways you sort of can unravel this story a little bit?
Yeah. So yes, reading magazines. I have to say that when you're doing it for research, it's stopped being fun to a certain degree. There's an amount of Vogue that I can read right now without kind of like, okay, but yeah, so a lot of women's magazines, but a lot of visual reading. So there's a lot of illustrations and sewing patterns and, even, unfortunately, for some, especially kind of like the older period, kind of like it's hard to find, actual clothes because costume collections are usually kind of like have this class biased into them. People who give their clothes are oftentimes rich people, so it's kind of like skewed costume collection towards kind of like the celebratory, right? And kind of like you won't donate the t-shirt that you would go to sleep with, right? You could donate your wedding dress.
So I should donate my t-shirt to a future class.
Right. Historians of the future will actually appreciate that. But kind of like, right, people don't donate usually their everyday clothes. And that was what I was interested in. And especially for, groups like African Americans or working class people that are oftentimes not so much representative at costume collections. So that was a source, but it kind of like been a source for certain things and not so useful for the things that I was looking. But on the other hand, people in the early 20th century and, late 19th really wrote about fashion, which is nice. I mean, not all the time you get, manifest of like, today I woke up and try to, because people don't do that. But feminists do mention it in their diaries and even in their public writings. And women themselves, every time they bought a new clothes, right? Like it's those little things that you tell your friends or you tell your diary of like, oh, today I went shopping and it was so great. So that also gave you kind of an insight to what these people wear that was not all the time what you've seen in magazines, but it gives you kind of like the understanding of, and photography. A lot of photographs as well were very helpful.
You talk about the sort of Gibson Girl outfit and the shirtwaist as being not a revolution, but an evolution. So can you talk a little bit about what it evolved from? What were people wearing prior to this? And they're still wearing corsets. It's not like a totally, a radical type of thing. But, what are the ways that this sort of outfit is a little bit simpler or more versatile for these women?
Yeah. So, for women, for a long time, there wasn't really a ready-made industry or what we call an industry, just because that women's bodies are more difficult to standardize, as we all know. There's no one size 10, right, that fits all. So the mass-made fashion really started with men clothing and really with the Civil War, with the need to make uniforms in large quantities. And that became kind of like, oh yeah, men, it's not a problem. Like we can do that. But for women, it was really difficult. And at first it was really about like wearing a dress. So for a dress, it really needs to be fitted to a body. Even if the dress has a few parts, it's not something that, everybody can, and it's not something that you can wear on your own. Oftentimes, you need someone to help you get dressed, whether it's, to pull the corset or to kind of like button the buttons on your back. You cannot do it on your own. So, it's not always the the servants, but it's sometimes your mother or your sister or, your husband. But it really is debilitating in some sense that you can't even dress and undress on your own. And what the shirtwaist did was really, it's a kind of like a female version of a male shirt. So it was easier to standardize because it was kind of like in a loose fit that was gathered at the waist. So kind of like creating this pigeon-like image, but it was easier to standardize. And then the industry could not only mass manufacture it, but also kind of like start to kind of like think about sizes. And maybe we can group women into sizes and then to have it all people to buy it. And it really is about buying clothes that really kind of starting to take off in this period. Because a lot of people made their own clothes, or, if they could afford it, they would send it to a dressmaker. But it wasn't something that you bought. And the shirtwaist was really the first item that women bought. It had grades for sure. Like you could buy a shirtwaist for $50 and you could buy it for 15 cents. But all of these women could buy this shirt to look fairly the same, right? It's the same styles, even if it's not the same quality. And they could look, respectable. It was very convenient, so they could go to work with. They look respectable enough so they could, go out of the town and do stuff. You won't go to a dinner party wearing a shirtwaist, but for everyday wear, it was definitely, not something that you need to change. So you could go to the entire day with this. And even if the turnout rate was very fast, especially for kind of like the cheaper shirtwaist, so you could wear them out. This is part of also why we don't find a lot of shirtwaists in costume collection, because people wore them out and then buy a new one. And it's not that much of an expense that, like a dress you would buy oftentimes, especially if you're coming from, working class, you will have a really good one dress that you wear all the time for everything. But, the shirtwaist is something that you can wear and wear out more often, and you can replace. And then you can also change, for the changes in fashion of shirtwaist were not that extreme. Like you add like embroiderment or kind of like, or changing the height of the collar. It wasn't maybe the sleeve, right? In the mid 90s, sleeves kind of like going really big. But those are kind of like minor changes that you can even do it yourself. And we need to remember, women at the time knew how to sew. That was not kind of like a rare skill. And most of kind of like garment workers, right? That was their job. They knew how to kind of like, even if they couldn't afford oftentimes the shirtwaist that they were making, they could still, a piece of lace from the factory and then kind of like sew it to their own shirtwaist. So they knew how to kind of like maneuver the system to become fashionable. And then they can present themselves as part of the trend, part of this world of being fashionable. I mean, and it's something that we see even today, right? We don't, when we wear H&M and Zara, who are basically knockoffs for more couture kind of like fashion, but we all kind of like wear the same styles and kind of like have this common language in terms of fashion that later on is being translated into political activism. And later on, when garment workers will go on strike, they can get that solidarity from the middle class and the rich women of New York that's standing with them in the picket line and getting arrested with them because to some degree, they look the same. So there, it is also allowing for these cross-class and cross-race solidarities that are based on kind of like this commonality of fashion.
Yeah, and this cross race piece is so interesting. So the Gibson Girl, of course, is pictured as white and fairly well off, lady of leisure kind of thing. But you're talking about the working class who are able to adopt this look as well. But then also the African American women are able to take this look and. You have these sort of great moments where people like Mary Church Terrell are talking about needing to sort of look respectable. Can you talk about the race piece of it as well?
Yeah, and it is there is this politics of respectability that and especially for African Americans who are barred from not just civil rights and equality, but also many of them really need to fight for their humanity, and it's really for them looking respectable, looking fashionable. Is part. It is a political statement. Is saying I'm as good as you to some degree. And there's a lot of emphasis in looking good and putting the best, face that they can have towards white society, and kind of like, believing in the visual power, right, of photography, of appearance, that if you look at us and you look how beautiful we are and how well dressed we are, so people will say, oh, maybe, they're not, they do deserve the right they ask. And the Gibson Girl, again, because the shirtwaist becomes so prevalent, allows them to tap into kind of like this leisurely, this collegiate image that the Gibson Girl also have, and say, here, look, our students are also, dressed like a Gibson Girl. We can also claim this collegiate image that we have, that kind of like, that everybody's doing, right? And get that acceptance through that. And even though that sometimes maybe African Americans like will go more on the conservative side, or kind of like will try to kind of like up it up, in terms of embroidery or in terms of color, it still kind of like maintains like within the boundaries of what is fashionable. And you can see it even later on in the, in the 20th century, when feminists in the 70s are kind of like, foregoing any kind of like signs of femininity and thinking like this is oppressive, we don't want. And Black feminists say, no, like, maybe for you to wear, jeans is liberating. But for me, who are used to kind of like those hand-me-downs throughout the year, I'm not like gaining any liberation from looking like a slob or looking, not feminine. For me, being acknowledged as a beautiful woman, that's the liberating thing. That's for me is really the political statement, not kind of like rejecting those ideas. So it's kind of like an interesting dynamic of how fashion functioned differently for these groups.
Yeah, definitely. And so the initial sort of Gibson Girl look is, still a very long skirt, but you talk about these rainy day clubs, and then I think they call themselves the Rainy Daisies, who are sort of working on raising the hemline of the skirts. So can you talk about some of what their motivations for that are? And, they're maybe less successful than the Gibson Girl look, but still pretty successful in popularizing this idea.
Yeah, and it's important to think that again, like the connection between feminism and fashion is really going like way back, and kind of like, right, the kind of like the more known example that we might know is the bloomer, right? But that's a total fiasco, and it's really a trauma for many feminists and other women. They were like, no, like we don't want to even get associated with this. And they do try to find something that will be comfortable, because the bloomer were, at the end of the day, very convenient and comfortable and allowed mobility, but they didn't look good on you. So the Rainy Daisies are kind of like, we want to have it all. We want both to have like convenient clothes that we can go out and about the entire day without like dragging our skirts in those filthy streets. And streets were filthier in the 19th century than they are now. And not be worried about getting sick and getting our clothes dirty. And the bloomer for them was not an option. But what was an option was kind of like this, what we call short, what was not short. It was basically mid-calf, but it was shorter bicycle skirt, because at the time, bicycles are really becoming the trend. And some are wearing bloomers to ride the bicycle. But what really picks up is this shorter bicycle skirt that allows women to ride those bicycles without fall and getting the skirts tangled in their bikes. And they say, oh, look, this is kind of like can be a good solution for us. And so they do adopt those shorter skirts. Some of them even go very close to the knee. They never get to the knee. That will happen in the 20s. But they kind of like say, well, you know, this is part of fashion, and we kind of like everyone should wear according to their own taste, right? They really emphasize that it's like it's not a decree, it's not like a uniform. They're not forcing anyone. They do it because this is like they feel good about it, and it makes them look good, and it really is fashionable because hey, look at all kind of like those women riding their bicycles. So kind of like, why can't we just wear them off the bicycle? But it's interesting that hemlines are kind of like, you know, will come back, right? The question of hemlines will come back throughout the 20th century. You know, it begins with the rainy daisies, but in the 20s, there will be a big hoorah about kind of like this attempt to lengthen the skirt that at the time was at knee height, and women were like, no, like we're not giving it up. We're just like, we won, we fought to win suffrage, and we fought to win knee height skirts, and we're not gonna give it up so quietly. And it's interesting, and it is a fighting battles, and we see it again in the late 40s, and again with kind of like the mini skirt in the 70s, that women are kind of like especially with hemlines, and kind of like I'm very careful not to say, oh, this is a feminist fashion or this is a feminist style. But I think it's interesting how kind of like this question of hemlines and mobility and comfort is really coming back, and women do find the shorter lengths kind of like more liberating.
Yeah, so you're sort of leading into the next question I was going to ask anyway about this sort of who is driving these fashions. And so what we're talking about at the beginning with the Gibson girls, you know, Gibson is a guy, of course, who draws this drawing of a Gibson girl, and there are other people drawing similar drawings. But the kinds of things you're talking about now, this is very much women saying like, no, you're not going to do that to us. We're going to keep wearing things like this. So what does that push-pull look like in the late 19th into the 20th century about sort of who is driving these decisions about fashion?
So you're right. It's always kind of like a dialogue between the industry and kind of like women that are kind of like, they are the consumers. They have the money and they are making a decision. And sometimes they do vote with their purse. And it's interesting because at first, again, with the kind of like industrialization of this and the mass manufacturing of this industry, the industry is kind of like is in favor of this feminist arguments for simpler clothes, for simpler silhouettes, because it's easy to manufacture. It's much easier to standardize. So all those arguments are actually very much aligned with also economic interests that the industry finds useful. So at the beginning, right, where the clashes begin is when the industry say, well, we need to change the fashion because we need to make women to buy new clothes. That's kind of like, right, that's how the fashion works. And then that's how we get kind of like, right, seasons and that suddenly, you know, and trends that it's all about making us buying new clothes. But women do pushing back against that. And sometimes the industry cave and, and don't go as far as they planned with their plans, because women at the end are the ones who are making those consumer decisions. And as they will go to the 20th century, women will have more and more consumer power, and they know how to use it. They're very organized, whether it's with consumer leagues. Women do organize around those issues, and also around, they're organizing boycotts, they're organizing protests against skirts length. So they do know to kind of like, don't touch my wardrobe, right? Type of thing. But also kind of like, as we are progressing, kind of like the 1920s and kind of like into the 40s, the fashion industry is really becoming very feminized. The people who rule, there's always like the big retailers that are men, but kind of like if you even look at couture designers, this is the era of Chanel, Lanvin, and all of these. They're French, but they are kind of like setting the tone, and there are women, and they're kind of like pushing themselves, kind of like they're making clothes for women like themselves. And even in retail, because fashion was seen as kind of like this feminine occupation, really becomes a career. And by 1940, it's really kind of like the place where women are getting into kind of like executive positions and gaining power. So you see them, all of the big editors are women of the women's magazines. We have Dorothy Shaver and Lord & Taylor and other department stores. We have fashion designers in Hollywood. There's a lot of women working at the studios. So, and all of them are coming kind of like in a sense of like, we want to design clothes for ourselves, for women like ourselves. So yes, it's very much white women and young women and thin women like themselves. So it's not necessarily inclusive in that sense, but it is more of, it's not a male designer who's like, now you need to wear this very uncomfortable thing because I decide it's fashionable.
Yeah. So clearly everyone has to buy your book, because we could just keep talking all night, but we're not going to keep talking all night. So everyone just has to go buy the book so that they can get the rest of this. But I definitely want to make sure we have a chance to talk about sort of the current events in fashion and politics. And of course, your history doesn't get all the way here, but in your epilogue, you talk about things like the pussy hats and, sort of ways that politics and fashion go together even today. And of course, we have this fairly recent example of this with the Met Gala. And, everyone focused on AOC's dress that said tax the rich on the back. But Carolyn Maloney's dress was just amazing. Can you talk about a little bit about Carolyn Maloney's dress and, sort of how that really references these earlier eras of feminist fashion?
Yeah, no, I also really liked her dress because I think it was, and the theme was American independence. I think really fit well into kind of like really an homage to not just the ERA, which is her thing, but to suffragists in general, and kind of like the use of suffrage color, the white, purple, and gold and green, although it's the British suffragists who use that green, but really to think about. And I think, and again, like suffragists were very aware of their kind of like that they wore their politics literally. And I think what she did was very much kind of like, right, similar to the sashes that suffragists wore, was really interesting, and how this visual language that really suffragists pioneered are still with us and are still kind of like, you can still play with this imagery. And really, I think it's really fascinating how even today, like, I don't think a woman politician cannot wear white. It became kind of like this color because it was so much associated with suffrage. we saw it with Kamala Harris when she was giving her inaugural speech after she won. And it almost seemed like, even the text to reach, right, was a white dress. And it seems like, today, if you want to show that you're a politician who's for women's rights, you have to wear white. So I think, right, like Meloni dress was kind of like hoo-ha and kind of like really push it home. And that's part of the Met Gala, right? It's to do it in the extreme. But even in kind of like, during Congress hearings and kind of like the State of the Union, we still see those legacies. And I think there is more understanding that you can do a lot with fashion. I mean, there's certainly some women politicians who really, like AOC, really kind of like understand it. But Nancy Pelosi, there are others who are really good in understanding the power of fashion. And I think, going back to the feminists and the Gibson girls who are saying, this is not an oppressive thing. Like, if we are going to be judged by how we look and how we dress, then at least we'll, make it an empowering thing, and we'll play it, and we'll use it to our favor and to advance our own agendas while looking beautiful. So like, you will have nothing to say against it. And I think that is maybe the most important legacies that the feminists of a century prior left to us.
So tell everyone how they can pre-order your book so they can see all of it. And, we skipped over whole bunches of history that's included in the book that's also super fascinating.
Yeah, you can order it through Amazon or any other website that sells books, but also through University of Illinois Press, through their own website. Just Google Dressed for Freedom, and I'm there, the first result.
Excellent. And I'll put a link in the show notes too, so that people can see that. And I'll also put in links in the show notes to some of these images that we have talked about, because you really do need the images to understand some of this. And that's, of course, part of what is so fun about your book, is there are lots of images to sort of reference what you're talking about.
Yeah, podcast. It's kind of like not the best medium to talk about fashion, but I'm glad we did it anyway.
Is there anything else that you wanted to make sure we talk about?
What I really want people to take from my book is really to think about fashion seriously. And, and again, not that each of us are, getting up in the morning and writing our own manifestos for what we wear, but what we wear matters. And I think we need to stop with this kind of like, if you're a true feminist, we shouldn't reduce conversation to clothes, because I think we should talk about clothes. Like, there is a room for that. And even for the only reason that it's fun and it's pleasurable. And, and we also need to find joys in the life and in the archives and in our activism, and not just to kind of like talk about everything that is bad in life.
Feminists are allowed to have fun.
Right. Really, to think about not that only clothes matters, but also how I hope people will take it to their own private life.
Well, excellent. Enough. Thank you so much for joining me. This was a really fun conversation for me. And I kept thinking about, I just said the Murdoch mysteries, which of course are, this sort of late Victorian era, but I also watched things like Miss Fisher. And so, that's got, I watched a lot of murder mysteries, obviously, but, I watched them through the decades. And so a lot of this fashion was very familiar to me, and it was really neat to sort of think about it more seriously.
Yeah, thank you. It was really fun. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. You can find the sources used for this episode at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history. Or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions or episode suggestions, please email Kelly at unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review and tell your friends.
MSW